Good evening, dear friends, and welcome. If you are here, then I suspect you, like me, have a certain fondness for the dark hours, for locked doors and quiet footsteps, for the kind of mystery that does not let go of you, not even after the final page is turned. Tonight, we board the Orient-Express. It is the winter of 1952. The train cuts through the frozen countryside of Europe, snow pressing against every window, the world outside cold and still and silent. Inside, the carriages glow warmly, fine wine is poured. Strangers share a dining car and pretend not to notice one another. But somewhere in the night, in a compartment locked from the inside, a man is found dead. And just before the discovery, a passenger at the far end of the corridor swears she saw something, a shadow, slow and deliberate, moving past the frosted glass of the window, and then gone. The killer never left the train. Hercule Poirot is quite certain of it. What he is not yet certain of is everything else. Now then, let us begin. The train departs. The snow had been falling since Budapest. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of his compartment and watched it. The white fields rolling past in the last gray light of the afternoon, the bare trees standing like tired sentinels along the track. He had his hands clasped behind his back, which was a habit he had never quite managed to break, and his small polished shoes were planted precisely together on the carpet, which was a habit he had never tried to break at all. He was tired, not the dramatic exhaustion of a man who has climbed mountains or fought wars, nothing so romantic as that. It was the quiet, unremarkable tiredness of a man of 62 who had taken one too many cases this year, and had not slept well in 3 weeks. His back ached slightly from the Paris meetings. His head felt thick, and the rocking of the train, which he had always found soothing in younger years, was tonight doing nothing particularly useful for his digestion. He turned from the window and regarded his compartment with mild approval. It was, at least, first class. The Orient Express did not disappoint in such matters. The wood paneling was dark and warm, the bed linens crisp and white, the small lamp above the reading shelf casting a decent amber light. There was a half-finished cup of chamomile tea on the fold-down table which he had allowed to go cold. Another small failure of the evening. He picked it up anyway and drank it. Cold chamomile. Acceptable. Just. The train had departed from Paris the previous morning. By tomorrow evening, if the schedule held, and on the Orient Express, the schedule usually held, they would be passing through Yugoslavia. Istanbul was 2 days beyond that. Poirot had business there, of a quiet and administrative sort, and he was not particularly looking forward to it. Istanbul in February was not Istanbul at its finest. But a promise had been made, and Hercule Poirot, whatever his other limitations, kept his promises. He set down the cup and reached for his pocket watch. 6:43 in the evening. The dining car would open at 7. He supposed he ought to dress properly, though the thought required some summoning of energy. He ran a hand across his mustache, both sides in order, as always, and began the small ritual of making himself presentable. It was while he was adjusting his collar in the narrow mirror above the wash basin that he first heard the argument. Not loud, not the sort of thing that would alarm a casual traveler. But Poirot's ears had been sharpened by 40 years of listening to things that people did not intend to be heard. And what came through the thin compartment wall, muffled, yes, but unmistakable, was the sound of two people who were deeply, dangerously angry with one another, keeping their voices low on purpose. He could not make out the words. He caught only the shape of them. A man's voice, low and insistent, and then a woman's, sharp and controlled. Then silence. Then the man again, slower this time, as if he were making a point that required each word to land separately. Then nothing. Poirot finished with his collar and thought nothing more of it. Or rather, he filed it in the way he always filed such things, in a small, tidy drawer in the back of his mind, possibly relevant, possibly not. Do not discard. The dining car that evening was full. This was not unusual for the Orient Express. The dining car was always full because it was the only place on the train where the fiction of sociability could be properly maintained. People who had chosen the most private form of long-distance travel nevertheless found themselves seated across from strangers at white-clothed tables, making conversation over consommé and roast lamb, because the alternative, eating alone in one's compartment, felt, somehow, like an admission of defeat. Poirot was shown to a table for two near the window. The maître d'hôtel, a thin and very correct man named Favre, seated him with the particular deference reserved for passengers who tipped well and did not complain about the fish. Poirot ordered the soup, the lamb, and a small carafe of the Burgundy, and settled in to observe. There were, by his count, 11 other passengers in the dining car that evening. At the table directly to his left sat a large Englishman, broad across the shoulders, red in the face, with the confident bearing of a man who had spent his life being the most important person in whatever room he occupied. He was somewhere in his mid-50s. His suit was expensive but not elegant. He ate quickly and with great concentration, as though the lamb were a problem to be solved. He had not looked up once since Poirot sat down. Across from the Englishman, though clearly not with him, the body language made that plain, sat a young woman of perhaps 28. Dark hair pinned back simply, a gray dress that was good quality but not new. She was reading a book which she held at an angle that suggested she was using it less for reading and more for not looking at the room. Every few minutes her eyes moved briefly from the page to the Englishman and then back. She was pretending, Poirot thought, not to know him. She was doing it not quite well enough. Further down, at a table for four occupied by only 3 people, sat a Hungarian couple, or so Poirot assumed from the fragments of language he caught, an older man and a somewhat younger woman, both immaculately dressed, both silent. Between them and slightly apart sat a young man in his early 30s with fair hair and the kind of face that had once been very handsome, and was now beginning to show the early damage of whatever he had been doing to himself for the past few years. He was drinking wine a little too quickly and staring out the window at the dark. At the far end of the car, alone at a corner table, sat the passenger that Poirot found most immediately interesting. He was a man of about 50, slight build, unremarkable in almost every visible way. Gray suit, gray hair at the temples, a face that you might forget the moment you looked away from it. He had ordered, it appeared, only coffee, and was writing in a small notebook with great industry. He did not look up. He did not look around. He was, as far as Poirot could observe, entirely self-contained. It was precisely this quality that interested Poirot most. In his experience, people who worked very hard at being invisible were almost never invisible by accident. He filed this too. In a slightly more prominent drawer, dinner passed without incident, which Poirot appreciated. The soup was good, the lamb was better, the Burgundy was entirely satisfactory. He exchanged pleasantries with Favre about the snow, and with his temporary table companion, a Swiss gentleman joining halfway through the first course, about nothing much at all. By 8:30, he was back in his compartment with a second cup of chamomile, this one hot, and the very slight but genuine pleasure of a decent meal behind him. He read for an hour, a monograph on Byzantine ecclesiastical architecture, which he had been meaning to finish for 6 months. He made it through 4 pages before his eyes began to feel unreliable, and he set it down. By 10 o'clock the train had settled into its night rhythm. The rocking was steadier now, the sounds of other passengers in their compartments gone quiet. Somewhere further up the carriage a door closed. The heating pipes ticked softly. Outside, the snow continued. Poirot turned off the reading lamp, lay back against the pillow with his hands folded on his chest, and prepared to sleep. He was almost there, that pleasant sliding sensation of the day releasing its grip when he heard it. A sound, very brief, very close, not a voice this time, not an argument, something simpler. Something that his brain, even half asleep, registered and would not let go of. A single knock. Solid and deliberate. From somewhere very close. The compartment next to his, he thought, though on the train it was sometimes difficult to be precise. And then, after a pause of perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, the sound of a door handle being tried, slowly, carefully, and then nothing. Poirot lay still for a long moment, listening. The train moved on through the dark, the snow fell, the heating pipes ticked. He told himself it was nothing. A passenger trying the wrong compartment in the dark. It happened. People were tired. Numbers on doors were small, and the corridors were dim. He closed his eyes again. But the small, tidy drawer in the back of his mind did not close. It stayed open and waited. The shadow at midnight. He did not sleep well. This was not entirely surprising. Poirot had never been a particularly gifted sleeper, even in his younger years. And the knock, that single, deliberate knock, had lodged itself somewhere behind his eyes in the way that certain sounds did when they did not belong. He lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the train, the rhythm of the wheels on the track, the occasional groan of the carriage shifting, the wind pressing against the window glass in long cold gusts. At some point he drifted. Not deeply. The kind of shallow, unsatisfying sleep that leaves a man more aware of having slept poorly than rested. He woke at 11:30. He was certain of the time because he looked at his pocket watch before he did anything else. A lifelong habit. The watch always on the fold-down table within reach. Never left in a pocket overnight. 11:30. The train was still moving. Of course it was still moving. He lay still for a moment and listened. Quiet. The normal quiet of the train at night. Nothing to explain why he had woken. He was about to turn over and make a second attempt at sleep when he saw it. The curtain of his compartment window was not fully drawn. He had left a gap of perhaps 3 inches on one side. Not intentional. Simply the result of drawing it with insufficient care before bed. Through this gap the dim blue light of the corridor seeped in, faint but steady, and across this light, slowly, with great deliberateness, passed a shadow. Poirot did not move. He watched it. It was the shadow of a person. That much was certain. The shape of a shoulder, the suggestion of a head, elongated and slightly distorted by the angle of the light source further down the corridor. It moved from left to right across the narrow gap in the curtain, and then it was gone. He waited. Nothing followed it. He sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and reached for his dressing gown. Dark burgundy wool. Another small comfort he did not apologize for. He put on his slippers. He crossed to the door and stood with his hand on the handle for a moment, listening. Then he opened it. The corridor was empty. He looked left. He looked right. The blue night lights ran in a low line along the ceiling of the carriage, casting everything in the same flat, shadowless color. The carpet ran straight in both directions. The doors on either side were all closed. There was no one. He stepped out and stood in the corridor, which was rather cold. The heating was reduced at night, and the chill came through the exterior walls quite persistently. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, which felt considerably longer, and heard nothing but the train. Then he went back inside, closed his door, and sat on the edge of his bed with his dressing gown pulled around him, thinking. Someone had walked past his compartment at 11:30 at night. This was not, in itself, remarkable. People walked to the lavatory. People were restless on trains. People could not sleep, went to find water, went to smoke, went for any number of entirely ordinary reasons. But the way that shadow had moved, slowly, too slowly for someone simply passing through. It had the quality, and here Poirot paused, searching for the right word, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. It had the quality of someone who did not want to make a sound. He was sitting there still thinking when the scream came. It was a woman's voice, short and sharp. Not the prolonged scream of cinema, but the kind that is cut off quickly by the screamer herself, as though she had remembered in the same instant that she did not want to be heard. It came from the direction of the next carriage along. Poirot was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. He moved into the corridor and towards the connecting door at the end of the carriage. Through the small window in the door, he could see the next corridor, also empty, also blue-lit. And then the door opened from the other side, and a woman came through it, and nearly walked directly into him. She was the young woman from dinner, the dark hair now loose around her shoulders, the gray dress exchanged for a robe hastily put on. Her face was white. Not pale, but genuinely white, the color of a person from whom something has been suddenly removed. She stopped when she saw him. Her hand went to her mouth. "Monsieur," she said in French, and then stopped. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said very quietly, "what has happened?" She looked back down the corridor she had come from, then at him. Her eyes were working very hard at something, deciding, he thought, how much to say. "The door," she said at last. "Compartment 7. I walked past it just now, and the door was open. Just slightly. And I looked in because the light was on inside, and I thought perhaps someone had left it." She stopped again. "And?" Poirot said. "There is a man in there," she said. "He is on the floor, I think." She pressed her fingers harder against her mouth. "I think he is not breathing." Compartment 7 was 3 doors down from where they stood. The door was indeed open by perhaps 4 inches. A thin line of light fell across the corridor carpet. Poirot approached it carefully, noting without quite deciding to note it that the corridor carpet showed no footprints. The pile was too short and too firm for that, and pushed the door open with 2 fingers at the very edge, so as to touch as little as possible. The man inside was the slight, gray-suited man from the corner table in the dining car. He was lying on his back on the narrow floor between the bed and the exterior wall, one arm stretched out and the other folded beneath him at an angle that suggested he had not chosen to lie down but had fallen. His eyes were open. His face held the particular stillness that Poirot had seen enough times in his life to recognize without needing to verify. But he verified anyway. He crossed the small compartment in 2 steps and pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck, just below the jaw, and held them there for 10 seconds. Nothing. He was dead. Had been dead, Poirot estimated, for somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour. The body was still warm, but the particular warmth was already changing. He had felt it before that transition, the body beginning its slow resignation. He straightened and stood very still for a moment, looking at the compartment. It was, and this was the detail that immediately sharpened every one of his faculties, completely undisturbed. The bed had not been slept in, but it had been turned down. The pillow undented, the sheets crisp and flat. The man's jacket was hung on the hook behind the door with great neatness. His shoes were placed together beside the bed. His small leather briefcase sat on the luggage shelf above, its clasps closed. The notebook he had been writing in at dinner was on the fold-down table, closed, with his pen laid parallel to it. The window was shut and latched. Poirot checked it without touching the latch. He leaned close and examined the mechanism, which showed no signs of recent forcing or tampering the door. He turned and examined the door. The lock on the Orient-Express compartments was of the standard type, a bolt that could be thrown from inside and a key lock operable from the outside. The bolt was not thrown. The door had been closed but not locked from inside, which meant if the man had locked himself in, he had used only the key lock, not the bolt, or he had not locked the door at all, or someone else had closed it from outside after leaving. Poirot stood in the middle of the compartment, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the dead man on the floor and thought about several things at once. This was something he had always been able to do, hold multiple possibilities in his mind simultaneously, like plates spinning, without letting any of them fall until he was ready to examine them individually. Some people found this quality unsettling in him. He had never particularly cared. He crouched down beside the body again and looked more carefully this time. He looked at the man's hands. No defensive marks, no broken nails, no sign of struggle. He looked at the man's face and neck. No visible bruising, no petechiae, nothing that said strangulation. He looked at the man's lips. There was the very faint trace of something at the corner of the mouth, a slight discoloration, easy to miss in the amber light of the compartment lamp. Poirot did not touch it. He looked at it for a long moment, then he stood up. Poison, he thought. Almost certainly. But the how and the what? Those were questions for a doctor, and there was no doctor on this train. There was only Poirot, which would, he reflected, have to be sufficient. He came back out into the corridor. The young woman was still there, her back against the opposite wall, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She had recovered some color, but not much. "Is he?" she began. "Yes," Poirot said simply. He saw no benefit in softening it. She closed her eyes briefly. "I knew him," she said, before Poirot had asked anything. "Not well, but I knew him," Poirot said. She opened her eyes. She said, "Edmund Harrington. He was a lawyer from London." Poirot looked at her steadily. "And you, mademoiselle, your name?" "Vivienne," she said. "Vivienne Marsh. You are traveling to Istanbul?" "To Bucharest," she said. "I get off at Bucharest." Poirot nodded slowly. Then he looked back at the closed door of compartment 7 and said, almost to himself, "The window was latched from inside. The door shows no sign of forcing. And yet Monsieur Harrington did not take poison by his own hand. Of that I am already quite certain." Vivienne Marsh looked at him. "How can you possibly be certain of that? You have been in there 2 minutes." 1 minute and 40 seconds, Poirot said, which was not quite true, but close enough. "And I am certain because of what is not there, mademoiselle. There is no vessel, no glass, no vial, no paper, nothing from which he might have taken whatever killed him. If a man poisons himself, he uses something. That something must be somewhere. It is not in that compartment." She was quiet for a moment. "Then someone brought it to him." "Someone brought it to him," Poirot agreed, and then left. "Through a door that shows no sign of forcing. Through a window latched from inside," he paused. "The killer," he said quietly, "did not come from outside the train, and they have not left it. They are here, on this train, in one of these compartments." He looked down the blue-lit corridor, at the closed doors, the still carpet, the cold and silent carriage, and for just a moment, standing there in his dressing gown and slippers at midnight on a snow-locked train somewhere between Budapest and Belgrade, Hercule Poirot felt something that he would not have admitted to another living soul. He felt, very briefly, the particular unease of a man who knows that the answer is somewhere very close, and that finding it before someone else is harmed is not a certainty. He straightened his dressing gown. He smoothed his mustache, left side first, then right. Then he went to wake the train conductor. The dead man's secret, the conductor's name was Richter. He was a thin, precise Austrian of about 55, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that things ran correctly and had developed, as a result, a profound and personal offense at anything that did not. He arrived at compartment 7 in his uniform coat, hastily buttoned one collar point slightly askew, and stood in the doorway looking at Edmund Harrington's body with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem that falls entirely outside the category of problems he was trained to handle. "Mon Dieu," he said, which surprised Poirot slightly, as it was not what he would have expected from a precise Austrian. "Quite," Poirot said. "We will need to speak with the passengers, all of them, and the compartment must be closed. Nothing touched, nothing moved. Can you manage that?" Richter pulled himself together with visible effort. "I will lock it," he said. "I have the master key." "Good. And Richter, one more thing. The train must not stop." The conductor looked at him. "Monsieur, if we stop at the next station, people will leave. People who perhaps should not leave. Keep to the schedule. The next major stop is Belgrade, yes? At 6:40 in the morning, yes. Then we have until 6:40. Poirot glanced at his watch. Just past midnight. 6 hours and 40 minutes. It will be enough. He said this with more confidence than he entirely felt, but Richter did not need to know that. He began, as he always began, with the facts. Back in his own compartment with a fresh cup of tea, he had asked the night attendant, a sleepy young man named Luca, who had produced it with commendable speed and minimal complaint. Poirot sat at the fold-down table and thought carefully about what he knew. Edmund Harrington, a lawyer from London, traveling alone in first class on the Orient-Express in the middle of February, which was not the time most lawyers from London chose to travel to the east. He had eaten alone at dinner. He had been writing in a notebook. He had worked, with considerable effort, at being invisible. A man who works at being invisible is either hiding from something or watching something. Sometimes both. The method of death. No visible marks of violence, no sign of struggle in the compartment. A faint discoloration at the corner of the mouth consistent. Though Poirot was careful not to overcommit himself here, he was not a toxicologist, with certain alkaloid compounds. The body warm but cooling. Death somewhere between 10:30 and midnight, which meant before Poirot had heard the knock or around the same time. The knock! He had been thinking about the knock since it happened, and he had arrived at the following. It was not the knock of a visitor announcing themselves. A visitor knocks and waits. This had been a single knock, solid, deliberate, and then the sound of a handle being tried. It had the quality of someone checking, confirming, making certain that the door was closed and would stay closed, which suggested that whoever knocked had already been inside the window. Latched from within. He had checked this carefully. The latch was old but functional, the kind that required a deliberate two-handed movement to operate, not something that could be engaged accidentally or from outside without specialist tools that no one on a passenger train was likely to possess, which brought him, as it always brought him, to the door. He turned this problem over in his mind with the particular patience he reserved for problems that resisted quick resolution. The door had been closed but not bolted. He had found it open, 4 inches, when Vivian Marsh had led him to it. This meant one of 3 things. Either Harrington had not closed it fully when he returned to his compartment, and it had drifted open slightly with the movement of the train, or someone had left through it and pulled it to without latching it properly, or someone had opened it from outside after the fact, for reasons not yet clear. He preferred the second. It had the most explanatory power, but he did not commit to it. He picked up his small notebook. He always traveled with one, a narrow thing in dark green leather, and wrote 3 names. Vivian Marsh, the large Englishman, the fair-haired young man. Then, after a pause, he added a 4th. The Hungarian couple, treat as one for now, verify. He looked at the list. Then he added, below it, a single line. What was Harrington writing? The notebook on the fold-down table in compartment 7. Closed pen laid beside it. He had not opened it. He had not wanted to disturb anything before Richter locked the compartment. But that notebook was, he was already fairly certain, considerably more important than it appeared. He finished his tea, which had gone lukewarm again. He seemed to have a particular talent for allowing tea to go lukewarm, and began. He spoke to Richter first, properly in the narrow attendant's alcove at the end of the carriage. The conductor confirmed what Poirot had already suspected. Edmund Harrington had boarded at Paris. He had made no special requests, caused no difficulties, exchanged no words with any other passenger that Richter had observed. His ticket was first class, single compartment, through to Istanbul. He had paid in cash, which was not unusual, but was not the most common arrangement either. Did anyone visit his compartment this evening? Poirot asked. Before midnight? Richter considered. I was in this carriage until approximately 9 o'clock. I did not see anyone enter his compartment. But after 9 I was in the next carriage. There was a small issue with the heating in compartment 12. How long were you away? Perhaps 40 minutes. Perhaps a little more. Poirot noted this. 40 minutes, plenty of time. The other passengers in this carriage, Poirot said. How many? In this carriage, 6 compartments occupied. Yourself. Monsieur Harrington. God rest him. The English gentleman in compartment 4, a Mr. Caldwell, Geoffrey Caldwell. He boarded at Paris also. The large man, Poirot said. Red face. Expensive suit. That is him, yes. Compartment 9, the young lady Miss Marsh. She boarded at Paris. Compartment 11. Monsieur Renard, he is a French academic, traveling alone, very quiet. I have not seen him leave his compartment since boarding. Compartment 3. A Turkish gentleman, Mr. Yildiz, who boarded at Vienna, and compartment 5, Richter paused, and something in the pause was interesting. The young man. He gave his name as Carroll, Robert Carroll. He also boarded at Paris. The fair-haired young man, Poirot said. Yes, you paused before his name, Poirot observed pleasantly. Richter looked at him, then carefully. He has been drinking heavily since Paris. He is not disruptive, but I have noticed him. As have I, Poirot said. And the Hungarian couple, they are in which carriage? The next carriage, monsieur. Compartment 14. Poirot nodded and thanked him and went to find Geoffrey Caldwell. Caldwell answered his door in a heavy traveling robe and the expression of a man who considered being woken at 12:30 an act of personal aggression. He was up close, even larger than he had appeared at dinner, broad and heavy across the chest, with hands that looked as though they had done physical work at some point in a previous life before the suits and the confidence arrived. "What in the hell is this about?" he said, looking at Poirot with open displeasure. Poirot introduced himself, explained briefly that a fellow passenger had died, and that he was making inquiries, and watched Caldwell's face go through several rapid changes. Irritation, surprise, something that might have been alarm, and then a careful settling into neutrality that Poirot found more interesting than any of the preceding expressions. "Who?" Caldwell said. "A man named Harrington," Poirot said. "Edmund Harrington, a lawyer from London." The neutrality on Caldwell's face held perhaps a second too long. "Don't know him," he said. "You were in the same dining car this evening," Poirot said. He sat at the far end. Slight man, gray suit, writing in a notebook. "I don't make a habit of studying other diners," Caldwell said. "I eat, I leave. I didn't notice anyone." "You were at dinner for approximately 45 minutes," Poirot said. "You ate quickly. You did not order dessert or coffee. You left at 8:17. Caldwell stared at him. "You timed me?" "I noticed things," Poirot said simply. "It is unfortunately involuntary. Where did you go when you left the dining car, Monsieur Caldwell?" "Back to my compartment. Where else would I go? And you remained there for the evening?" "I did. I had papers to read. I read them. I went to sleep." He looked at Poirot with steady, flat eyes. "I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. And I didn't know this Harrington fellow. So if that's all, one more thing," Poirot said pleasantly. "On the platform at Paris, before boarding, did you happen to speak with anyone? Any of the other passengers?" Something moved behind Caldwell's eyes very briefly. "No," he said. "Thank you," Poirot said. "You have been most helpful." He said this in a tone which made it absolutely clear that Caldwell had been the opposite of helpful, and walked away before the man could respond. Robert Carroll did not answer his door on the first knock, or the second. On the third, the door opened, and he stood there looking at Poirot with the eyes of a man who had been awake for some time and had not spent that time sleeping. His fair hair was disordered. His shirt was open at the collar. There was a half-empty bottle of scotch on the fold-down table behind him that Poirot noted without comment. He was younger than Poirot had initially estimated, perhaps 28 or 29. And despite the drinking and the sleeplessness and the general air of a man who was not being particularly kind to himself, there was something underneath it, a sharpness in the eyes, a tension in the jaw, that suggested the dissolution was not the whole story. "Monsieur Carroll," Poirot said, "I am sorry to disturb you at this hour." Carroll leaned against the doorframe and looked at him. "You're not a conductor," he said. "No," Poirot agreed. "I am Hercule Poirot. I am making inquiries about the death of a fellow passenger. Edmund Harrington." Carroll went very still. Not the stillness of a man who has not heard the name, the stillness of a man who has heard it and whose body has responded before his mind could instruct it otherwise. "He's dead?" Carroll said. "Yes." Carroll turned and walked back into his compartment and sat down on the edge of his bed. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the floor. Poirot stepped inside and stood. After a moment, Carroll said, without looking up, "How? We believe poison," Poirot said, "though it is not yet confirmed." Carroll nodded slowly. Nodded again, as if confirming something to himself rather than responding to Poirot. "You knew him," Poirot said. It was not a question. Carroll looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, Not from recent tears, Poirot thought, but from the longer and more sustained kind of damage. "Yes," he said. "I knew him. Tell me." Carroll was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the Scotch bottle, looked at it, and put it back down without pouring. It was, Poirot thought, a small but genuine decision. "Harrington was my father's lawyer," Carroll said. "Has been for 20 years. When my father died 14 months ago, Harrington handled the estate." He paused. "Or he was supposed to." Poirot waited. "There was money missing," Carroll said. "A significant amount. From the estate. I found it, or I found the absence of it, about 6 months ago. I went to Harrington's firm in London, and they told me he was no longer with them. Had left suddenly. No forwarding information." He looked at his hands. "I have been looking for him since September." "And you found him on this train?" Poirot said. "I found him on this train," Carroll confirmed. Poirot looked at the young man for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "Monsieur Carroll, did you speak with Harrington today? At any point since boarding?" Carroll met his eyes. "No," he said. "I saw him at dinner. I thought about it. I decided to wait until morning when I had—" He glanced at the Scotch, "when I had thought more clearly about what I wanted to say." "And this evening? After dinner? You remained in your compartment?" "Yes," Carroll said. "You heard nothing? No sound from the corridor?" Carroll shook his head, then stopped. "There was something," he said slowly. "Around 10, I think. Maybe a little after. I heard voices through the wall, not clearly, just the shape of voices. A man and a woman. It didn't last long." Poirot felt the small, neat drawer in the back of his mind swing open again. "The wall to which side?" he said. Carroll pointed. "Toward compartment 7. He found the notebook at 1:30 in the morning." Richter had locked compartment 7 as instructed, but had given Poirot the master key without needing to be asked twice. There was something in Poirot's manner, when he chose to employ it, that made people hand over master keys and answer questions and generally cooperate without entirely knowing why they were doing so. He entered the compartment carefully, disturbing nothing. He crossed to the fold-down table and opened the notebook. It was written in a small, very regular hand, the handwriting of a man trained in precision. The first half of the notebook was dense with legal notations, case references, initials, numbers. Nothing immediately illuminating, though everything would need to be read properly. He turned to the final pages, the ones most recently written. The last entry was dated that day. It was short, 6 lines. "Meeting confirmed for Belgrade Station, platform 2. He does not know I am on this train. I made certain of that. If this goes wrong, I have left everything with M. The copies are safe. They must not get the notebook before Belgrade." Poirot read it twice, then a third time. They must not get the notebook. He looked at the dead man on the floor of the compartment, still there, still the same profound and final stillness, and felt the shape of the thing beginning to assemble itself in his mind. Not complete, not yet, but the edges were there. Harrington had not been running from something. He had been carrying something, and someone on this train had known it. He closed the notebook, straightened, and stood for a moment in the lamplight of the locked compartment. The snow still falling past the latched window, the train still moving through the dark toward Belgrade. They must not get the notebook. They had not gotten it. Not yet. But they would try again. He was certain of that much, and next time it would not be poison from a careful distance. He put the notebook inside his dressing-gown pocket and left the compartment, locking it behind him. Poirot's little grey cells. He did not sleep at all after that. This was not entirely a choice. He lay down at around 2 in the morning, the notebook tucked inside his jacket, which hung on the hook behind the door. He was not, under present circumstances, leaving it on the table, and he closed his eyes and gave sleep a reasonable opportunity to arrive. It did not arrive. His mind, which had been trained over 40 years to find patterns in disorder, was not interested in sleep. It was interested in the notebook, in the shadow, in the locked window and the open door, and the faint discoloration at the corner of Edmund Harrington's mouth. So he gave up on sleep at 2:30, sat up and thought properly instead. This was, in his experience, almost always more productive. He began with what he knew for certain, the small solid ground of established fact, before the softer territory of inference and deduction. 1. Edmund Harrington was dead, poisoned, almost certainly, between 10:30 and midnight. 2. The compartment window was latched from inside. The door showed no sign of forcing. The killer had entered through the door, the only rational conclusion, and left through the same door, pulling it closed but not latching it. 3. Richter had been absent from the carriage for approximately 40 minutes. Somewhere between 8:45 and 9:30. The dining car had emptied by 8:30. This gave a window of opportunity of at least 1 hour, possibly longer, during which someone could have moved through the carriage without being observed by the conductor. 4. The notebook contained a record of something significant enough to kill for. A meeting at Belgrade Station. Copies left with someone identified only as M. A deliberate concealment of Harrington's presence on the train. 5. Someone on this train had known Harrington was carrying the notebook and had acted to obtain it before Belgrade. He moved from fact to the more interesting territory of what was almost certainly true but not yet proven. Carroll had known Harrington, had motive, the stolen inheritance, and had been on this train, a fact which could not be coincidence. But the young man's distress at the news of Harrington's death had struck Poirot as genuine. Performances could be constructed, of course. He had seen very fine performances in his time. But Carroll's stillness when he heard the name, the way his hands had gone to his knees, the decision about the Scotch bottle. These were not the responses of a man who had committed murder 2 hours earlier. They were the responses of a man who had been planning a confrontation and found it suddenly and permanently denied him. Unless, of course, Carroll was a very fine performer indeed. Poirot filed this possibility without dismissing it. Caldwell was a different matter. He sat with Caldwell for a long time, turning the man over in his mind. The flat, careful eyes, the neutrality that had held a second too long when Harrington's name was spoken, the claim of not having noticed anyone in the dining car, from a man who had struck Poirot, from the first moment of observation, as exactly the type who noticed everything and revealed nothing. The rapid departure from the dining car at 8:17, and the hesitation, that small but distinct hesitation, when Poirot had asked about the platform at Paris. On the platform at Paris, had he spoken with anyone? No, said too quickly, the word arriving before the consideration of it. Poirot had been conducting interviews for 4 decades, and he had learned, early and thoroughly, that the most informative answers were not the elaborately constructed lies, but the small reflexive denials. The truth that a person pushes away without thinking, because thinking about it would slow them down, and the slows would show. Caldwell had known someone on that platform, or had been watching someone, or had been watched. He picked up his notebook and wrote, "Caldwell, Paris platform. Who?" Then he wrote underneath it, the argument. Before dinner. Who was the woman? He had heard it through the compartment wall. A man's voice, insistent, and a woman's, sharp and controlled. Harrington's compartment was next to his. The voices had come from the direction of compartment 7. Carroll had heard voices too, around 10, through the wall on the other side of Harrington's compartment. A man and a woman. The same argument heard from 2 sides, or 2 separate exchanges. If the same, then the woman had been with Harrington twice that evening, before dinner and after. He looked at his list of passengers. The women on this train, in his carriage, were singular. Vivian Marsh. He thought about Vivian Marsh. She had found the body, or she had presented herself as the person who found the body. She had been walking past compartment 7 at. When, precisely? She had said she was going to the lavatory. The lavatory in this carriage was at the far end, beyond Poirot's own compartment. Harrington's was in the middle. She would have passed it going and returning. She had known Harrington's name immediately, had offered it without being pressed. Edmund Harrington, a lawyer from London. Not well, she had said, but I knew him, not well. An interesting qualification. The kind of thing a person says when they know someone better than they wish to admit. He added to his notebook, Vivienne Marsh, how did she know Harrington? The argument, was she the woman? And then, because the little gray cells were working now with the particular momentum they achieved in the small hours when everything was quiet, he wrote one more line. M. Who is M? The notebook entry. I have left everything with M. The copies are safe. M was not on this train. Or if M was on this train, Harrington had not said so. M was someone trusted. Someone who had the copies, whatever the copies were, and was keeping them safe. A lawyer's instinct, Poirot thought. Harrington had been a careful man. He had known he was in danger. The entry made that plain, the deliberate concealment of his presence on the train, and he had distributed the risk. The notebook on the train, the copies with M, which meant that whoever had killed him had gotten neither. Whether it was enough was another question. At 4 a.m. he made himself get up and do something practical, because sitting still with thoughts that were not yet ready to resolve themselves was, in his experience, unproductive and also hard on the back. He dressed properly. He would not be sleeping again tonight, and he refused to conduct serious investigation in a dressing gown, whatever the hour, and he went to speak with the Hungarian couple. They were in the next carriage, compartment 14. He had asked Richter for their full details. The man was Dr. Imre Vasarhely, a retired academic from Budapest, 63 years old, formerly a professor of international law at the university there. The woman was his wife, Clara. They had boarded at Vienna. An academic of international law, Poirot thought, making his way through the connecting door into the next cold corridor. Traveling at the same time as a London lawyer who was carrying documents significant enough to die for. This might be coincidence. Poirot had a complicated relationship with coincidence. He acknowledged its existence while personally declining to trust it. He knocked at compartment 14. There was a pause, longer than sleep would explain, he thought. And then the door opened, and Dr. Vasarhely looked out at him. He was fully dressed, which confirmed the pause. A man asleep does not dress before answering a midnight knock. He had been awake. He had heard Poirot coming, or had been waiting for someone. He was a handsome man, in the distinguished, weathered way of academics, who have spent a great deal of time in libraries, and not enough outdoors. White hair, carefully kept. Dark eyes that were sharp and assessing if in a face otherwise composed into polite neutrality. Monsieur, he said in French. Poirot introduced himself and explained, in brief, that a fellow passenger had died and that he was speaking with everyone on the train. Vasarhely's expression did not change, not tightening, not loosening, simply held. Come in, he said. The compartment was a double, larger than the singles in the next carriage. Clara Vasarhely was seated on the bed, also fully dressed, a book closed in her lap. She was younger than her husband by perhaps 15 years. Late 40s, Poirot estimated, with the kind of composed stillness that can come from either great serenity or great practice at concealing its opposite. He looked at Poirot when he entered and said nothing. "Which passenger?" Vasarhely said, settling into the small chair by the fold-down table and gesturing for Poirot to take the other. "A man named Harrington," Poirot said, watching them both. "Edmund Harrington." Clara Vasarhely's fingers moved on the cover of her book. A very small movement. She did not look at her husband. Vasarhely said, "I am sorry to hear it. I did not know the man." "You saw him at dinner," Poirot said. "The far end of the dining car, writing in a notebook." "I saw many people at dinner," Vasarhely said pleasantly. "I'm afraid I did not particularly attend to any of them." "Of course," Poirot said equally pleasantly. "And this evening, you both remained in your compartment?" "We did. We retired early. The journey is long and we are not young." He said it with a small, self-deprecating smile. Poirot smiled back with equal warmth and equal emptiness. "You are traveling to Istanbul?" "To Belgrade, in fact. We have business there." A pause. "Old friends." "How pleasant," Poirot said. "At what time do you plan to leave the train?" "At the station stop 6:40, I believe." "Indeed," Poirot said. He asked several more questions of no particular consequence, and received answers of no particular consequence, and at the end of it stood and thanked them both and left. In the corridor he stood for a moment. Belgrade. They were leaving at Belgrade. The notebook entry came back to him with sudden, clean precision. Meeting confirmed for Belgrade Station, Platform 2. Harrington had been going to meet someone at Belgrade Station, had been killed before he could, and now Dr. Imre Vasarhelyi, a retired professor of international law, traveling with his wife, maintaining his composure with impressive consistency, was also leaving at Belgrade. And Clara Vasarhelyi's fingers had moved on that book cover. Just slightly, just for a moment. But they had moved. He returned to his compartment and sat down and looked at his notebook for a long time. 5 passengers with some connection, proven or probable, to Edmund Harrington. Carroll, the inheritance. Caldwell, the denied recognition. Marsh, the argument. The Vasarhelius, the Belgrade connection. One of them had entered Harrington's compartment. He had administered poison. And the method of this was still troubling him, nagging at a corner of his mind. Because poison required proximity, required time, required either that Harrington had consumed something willingly, or that he had been given no choice. There were no signs of force, which meant he had consumed it willingly, which meant he had accepted something, a drink perhaps, or food, from someone he had let into his compartment. Someone he knew, someone he did not fear. That narrowed things considerably. Then left through the door, pulling it to, had walked back along the corridor past Poirot's window, the shadow, slow and deliberate, and returned to their own compartment. But here was the thing. Here was the thing that had been sitting quietly at the back of the little gray cells all evening, waiting for him to look at it directly. The shadow had moved from left to right across his window. Compartment 7 was to the left of Poirot's compartment. The shadow had been moving away from it, toward the end of the carriage, away from Caldwell, whose compartment was between Poirot and Harrington, away from Carroll, who was on the other side of Harrington entirely, toward the end of the carriage where the lavatory was, where Vivienne Marsh's compartment was. He sat with this for a long moment. Then he wrote in his notebook slowly and with care. The shadow moved toward compartment 9, Marsh. But Carroll heard the voices at 10. After dinner. Marsh was in the dining car until 8:30. The argument before dinner. Who was with Harrington then? Not Marsh. She was still at the table. He stopped. Read it back. The argument before dinner. He had heard it through the wall at, when? Precisely. He had been adjusting his collar. Before 7, before he went to dinner himself. Vivienne Marsh had been in the dining car all evening. He had seen her there. She had arrived before him and left after, which meant the woman in the argument before dinner was not Vivienne Marsh. He sat up straighter. There was another woman on this train, the Hungarian couple, Clara Vasarhelyi, whose compartment was in the next carriage, but who could perfectly well have walked through the connecting door and back again. He wrote her name, underlined it once. Then he wrote beneath it the 3 words that had defined the architecture of every serious case he had ever worked. Motive means opportunity. Opportunity, yes. The corridor, the absent conductor, the 40-minute window means the poison. Where had it come from and how had it been administered? This was still the central mechanical question. A drink? Something in the food? Something slipped into the chamomile tea. He thought of his own cold cup, and felt briefly, absurdly grateful it had been his own. And motive. Always, underneath everything, the motive. What had Harrington been carrying in that notebook that was worth a man's life? He looked out the window. The snow had thinned. He could see the dark shapes of trees now, the occasional distant light of a farmhouse. The sky to the east had the very faintest suggestion of gray at its lowest edge. 4 hours until Belgrade. He was not there yet. The gray cells had given him direction, but not destination. He had the edges of the picture, but not its center. And somewhere in the carriages around him, behind one of these closed and quiet doors, the person who had stood in Edmund Harrington's compartment and watched a man die was lying in the dark, waiting for morning. He picked up his pen again. He wrote one word in the center of an otherwise empty page and circled it and looked at it. Why? Not who, not yet. The who would come when the why was clear. It always did. He closed the notebook, placed it back inside his jacket, and sat in the lamp-lit quiet of his compartment while the Orient Express carried them all. The living and the dead, the guilty and the watching, through the last dark hours toward Belgrade. The web of lies, the gray at the edge of the sky, had become pale blue by the time Poirot moved again. It was just past 5 in the morning. Belgrade was an hour and 30 minutes away. The train had settled into the particular stillness of early morning, that hour when even the most restless sleepers have finally surrendered, and the world outside is not yet fully committed to being day. The snow had stopped entirely. The countryside moved past the window in long, flat stretches of white field and dark tree line, and the sky above it was the color of old pewter slowly warming. Poirot had been still for the better part of an hour, which those who knew him well would have recognized as significant. He was not a man who sat still without purpose. When Hercule Poirot was motionless, the little gray cells were doing anything but. He had been thinking about tea, specifically about tea as a method. The night attendant, Luca, had brought him chamomile at midnight, produced from a small service pantry at the end of the carriage. Hot water, tea bags, a tray, small covered pot of honey. Standard provision. Available to any first-class passenger who rang for it. Harrington's fold-down table, when Poirot had examined the compartment, had held only the notebook and the pen. No cup, no glass. Nothing from which a man might have drunk. But the absence of a vessel was not the same as the absence of the substance. The vessel might have been removed, taken away by whoever administered the poison, to eliminate the most obvious evidence, which required a vessel to have been brought in the first place. He thought about this. A visitor arrives at Harrington's compartment. Harrington admits them, willingly, without alarm, which means he knows them and does not fear them. The visitor brings something. A drink, most naturally, shared or offered. Harrington drinks. The visitor does not, or has taken precautions against their own portion. The visitor waits. Poison of the kind that leaves alkaloid traces at the mouth acts within minutes if the compound is sufficiently concentrated, and then leaves, taking the vessel with them, pulling the door to, walking back along the corridor past Poirot's window. It was clean. It was planned. It was not the act of someone who had made a sudden decision. But here was what had been sitting in his mind since 4 o'clock, quiet and patient, waiting to be examined. If you carry a cup or a glass through a sleeping train corridor at 11 o'clock at night, you are carrying something that can be seen and remembered. A vessel, even empty, is an object. It has presence, unless it is not a separate vessel at all. He sat with this for a moment, turning it carefully. Unless it is something that belongs to the train, something that would not be remarked upon if seen, that would seem to any observer entirely ordinary. He stood up. He put on his jacket. He went to the service pantry at the end of the carriage. Luca, the night attendant, was dozing on the small folding seat outside the pantry, with the practiced guilt-free sleep of someone whose job required it. He came awake immediately when Poirot approached, young enough that sleep still released him quickly, and stood up with the alert, slightly anxious expression of a man who has been caught, but is not certain of what. "Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Luca," Poirot said pleasantly, "I have a small question for you. The chamomile tea you brought me at midnight, you prepared it here, in this pantry?" "Yes, monsieur." "And the tray, it was a standard tray. Hot water, the tea, the honey." "Yes, in this carriage this evening, before you brought mine. Did you prepare any other trays?" Luca blinked, thought. "One," he said. "Earlier, around 10 o'clock, I think. A pot of coffee." Poirot kept his expression entirely pleasant. "Which compartment?" Luca hesitated. Not the hesitation of someone hiding something, Poirot judged, but the hesitation of someone uncertain whether they ought to say. "It was not ordered from a compartment," Luca said carefully. "A passenger came to the pantry directly. Asked for a pot of coffee. I prepared it and they took it." "They took it themselves," Poirot said, "rather than having you deliver it." "Yes, they said not to bother, they would take it." He paused. "I thought it was a little unusual, but it is not. Some passengers prefer it." "Indeed," Poirot said. "And this passenger, can you describe them for me?" Luca described them. Poirot thanked him, quietly and genuinely, and walked back along the corridor toward his compartment. His face was composed, his hands were still, but behind his eyes, several things that had been separate were becoming, with the particular quiet satisfaction of a well-ordered mind, one thing. He knocked at the door of compartment 4 at 5:15 in the morning. Geoffrey Caldwell took longer to answer this time. Long enough that Poirot wondered briefly if he had miscalculated, if Caldwell was, in fact, deeply asleep and innocent of everything. But the door opened, and Caldwell stood there in yesterday's shirt and trousers, and behind his eyes was the look of a man who had not slept and had known, for some hours, that this knock was coming. "Again," Caldwell said, flat. "No particular surprise. Again, Poirot, I come in." Caldwell stepped back. Poirot entered and remained standing, because the compartment was small, and he found he preferred to conduct this particular conversation on his feet. "You told me last night," Poirot began, in the same pleasant tone he had used since Paris. "That you did not know Edmund Harrington." Caldwell said nothing. "You told me you did not speak with anyone on the platform at Paris. Still nothing." "These were both," Poirot said, without heat, untruths. Caldwell looked at him steadily. The flat, careful eyes had not changed, but there was something behind them now. A calculation, Poirot thought, of the kind that a man performs when he is deciding how much rope he has left, and whether to use it climbing or to cut it entirely. "How long have you known Harrington?" Poirot said. A long pause. Then, as though the word cost something, 8 years. "In what capacity?" Caldwell moved to the window and stood looking out at the pale fields, his back to Poirot, which was interesting. A man turns his back when he is about to say something true and does not want to be watched saying it. "I run an import business," Caldwell said. "Legitimate, mostly. 8 years ago I was going through a difficult period, financially. I made some arrangements that were not entirely within the boundaries of what is strictly legal. Harrington was involved as a facilitator." "He helped you move money," Poirot said. Caldwell's shoulders tightened. "Among other things. And the notebook," Poirot said. "The records he was carrying, they concerned these arrangements." A pause. "I assume so. I didn't know about any notebook until you mentioned it." "But you knew he was on this train." Another pause. Longer. "I saw him on the platform at Paris," Caldwell said. "He didn't see me. Or I thought he didn't. I considered getting off, changing trains. But I had business in Istanbul, and I told myself it was coincidence, that he wouldn't." "He stopped. That he wouldn't cause difficulty for you," Poirot said. "I have spent 8 years building something clean," Caldwell said, and there was a roughness in his voice now that had not been there before. "A proper business, good work. What I did with Harrington, that was another time. I don't want it dragged into the light." He turned from the window. His face was tired and, Poirot thought, rather older than it had looked at dinner. "But I did not kill him," Caldwell said. "Whatever you were thinking, I did not. I went back to my compartment after dinner and I stayed there. I had no reason to kill him. The records he was carrying. I don't know what was in that notebook, but whatever arrangement he and I had is old enough to be nearly unactionable legally. I'm not happy about it coming out. But I would not kill a man over embarrassment." Poirot looked at him for a long moment. The gray cells were doing their quiet, methodical work, measuring the statement against the man, looking for the place where one did not fit the other. He found no such place, which was not the same as certainty, but was some. "The argument," Poirot said. "Before dinner you heard it through your compartment wall?" Caldwell frowned. "What argument? You did not hear raised voices from the direction of compartment 7 before 7 o'clock?" "No," Caldwell said, with what sounded like genuine puzzlement. I had the radio on. The BBC World Service. I always do on trains." He paused. "I wouldn't have heard much through that." Poirot nodded and filed this and excused himself. Vivian Marsh answered her door before he finished knocking, which meant she had been awake and waiting. She was dressed. Gray dress again, or one very like it, and her dark hair was pinned back with a neatness that suggested she had done it deliberately rather than hastily. She had been preparing herself for this conversation. "I thought you would come back," she said. "Then we may dispense with certain preliminaries," Poirot said pleasantly, and she stood aside and let him in. She sat on the bed. Poirot took the small chair. The window showed the same flat white fields, and in the growing light the compartment had the slightly exposed quality that daylight gives to spaces designed for darkness and sleep. "You argued with Harrington," Poirot said, "before dinner, in his compartment." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Yes. You told me you did not know him well. I know." She looked up. That was not quite accurately. She was quiet for a moment, not stalling, he thought, but choosing. "Edmund Harrington was my uncle," she said, "my mother's brother. We have not been close for many years. There was a disagreement in the family a long time ago about money. The usual thing, a small, humorless smile. When I saw him on the train, I was surprised and angry. I went to his compartment before dinner and I said some things that I had been wanting to say for quite a long time." "What things?" "That he had destroyed my mother's trust in him. That the money he had taken from our family—" She stopped, began again more carefully. "My mother died 2 years ago. She died believing her brother was an honest man. I discovered after her death that he was not, that he had managed a trust she held, and that the management had been creative, let us say." Poirot was very still. Carol's stolen inheritance, Vivian Marsh's family trust, Caldwell's financial arrangements. The notebook was not a single document. It was, he now understood, a record of multiple transactions, multiple victims, multiple motives sitting in the carriages of a single train. Harrington had not been unlucky. He had been extraordinarily unlucky. He had managed, through whatever combination of fate and circumstance, to find himself on the same train as 3 people he had wronged. Or had he? The thought arrived quietly and sat down and refused to leave. Or had he? "Mademoiselle Marsh," Poirot said, very carefully, "when did you book your ticket for this train?" She looked at him. 3 weeks ago." "And do you know, has anyone spoken with you in the weeks before this journey about Harrington? About where he might be found?" She was very still now. Someone sent me a letter," she said slowly. 6 weeks ago. It told me that Edmund Harrington would be traveling on the Orient-Express on this date. It said that if I wished to confront him about what he had done to my family, here was my opportunity." Poirot felt the picture assembling itself. The edges, the middle, the thing he had been circling since 2 in the morning. "Did you keep the letter?" he said. "No. I thought it was. I didn't think about who had sent it. I was too angry about what it said." "Of course," Poirot said gently. "One more question, mademoiselle, and then I will leave you in peace. Last night, after you found the body, you said you were walking to the lavatory." "Yes. The lavatory in this carriage is at the far end, beyond my compartment. Compartment 7 is in the middle. You would have passed it going and returning." "Yes. You passed it on the way there and saw nothing. On the return, the door was open." He paused. "How long were you at the lavatory, mademoiselle?" She frowned. "A few minutes." "Why?" "Because the shadow that passed my window moved toward your end of the carriage, at approximately 11:30. "And you reached the body at approximately 11:30. He looked at her steadily. "If the killer left the compartment and walked toward the lavatory end, and you were also walking from the lavatory end toward the compartment, then at some point, in that corridor, you must have passed one another." Vivian Marsh stared at him. "There was no one in the corridor when I came back," she said. "No one at all. I would have seen." She stopped. "Unless," Poirot said quietly, "they heard you coming and stepped into a doorway, or unless they were already back inside their compartment before you reached that point." He stood. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been this time genuinely helpful." He had one conversation left. He walked through the connecting door into the next carriage, where the sky through the corridor windows was now properly pale blue, and the fields were sharpening from gray shapes into distinct trees and fences and frozen streams. He could feel Belgrade approaching in the quality of the light, the way the countryside was beginning to organize itself into something closer to the outskirts of a city. 1 hour, perhaps less. He knocked at compartment 14. Clara Vasarhelyi opened the door. Her husband was visible behind her, seated at the fold-down table with a cup of coffee. The pot on the table between them was the particular shade of very strong, very dark coffee that suggested it had been sitting for some time, or that it was not the first pot of the morning. Poirot looked at the coffee pot. He looked at Clara Vasarhelyi's hands. Then he looked at her face. She was watching him look at the coffee pot. She had understood in the moment his eyes moved exactly what he was thinking. He saw it. That rapid, internal calculation, the assessment of what he knew and what he could prove. She was quick. He gave her that without reservation. "Madame Vasarhelyi," Poirot said, "I would like to speak with you alone if your husband will permit it. There are a few small matters I think you can help me with." Dr. Vasarhelyi rose from his chair. "Whatever you need to ask, you may ask in front of me," he said, pleasantly, but with the particular firmness of a man who has decided where he stands and has no plans to move. "As you wish," Poirot said. He entered the compartment and stood, because there was only one chair and Vasarhelyi was in it, and looked at them both with the mild, slightly unfocused expression that people often mistook for vagueness, and that was, in practice, the face he wore when he was paying the most acute attention. "Madame Vasarhelyi," he said, "last night, at approximately 10 o'clock, you went to the service pantry in the next carriage and collected a pot of coffee. You took it yourself, rather than having the attendant deliver it. Where did you take it?" The silence in the compartment was of the specific quality that precedes a decision. Poirot waited it out. He was very good at waiting. "To my compartment," Clara Vasarhelyi said. "We wanted coffee." "There is a pot on your table," Poirot said. "It appears to have been there for some time. Was that also collected from the pantry?" "Luca brought that one," Vasarhelyi said. "An hour ago." "I see," Poirot said. He looked at Clara. "The attendant, Luca, described the passenger who collected the pot at 10 o'clock. The description he gave was accurate and detailed. He has a good memory for faces." He paused. "He described you, madame." Clara Vasarhelyi held his gaze without flinching. She had, he thought, remarkable composure, the kind that is built rather than natural, constructed over years for specific purpose. "And this is significant to you," she said. "A pot of coffee was collected from the pantry at 10 o'clock, Poirot said. "A man was found dead in his compartment at 11:30, poisoned by a substance most likely administered in a drink, and no vessel was found at the scene." He looked at her calmly. "Yes, madame. I find it somewhat significant." The silence again. Then Vasarhelyi said, in a voice that had changed, all the pleasantness gone, something flat and careful in its place, "You are making a considerable accusation based on a coffee pot, Monsieur Poirot." "I am making no accusation," Poirot said pleasantly. "I am noting a connection. Belgrade is 40 minutes away. I suggest we use the time well." He sat down on the edge of the bed, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. The final revelation, Clara Vasarhelyi looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down on the bed beside Poirot. Not close, but deliberately, as though choosing to occupy the same level rather than remain standing above him, was itself a kind of decision. Her husband stayed in his chair. The three of them formed a small, quiet triangle in the early morning light of the compartment, and outside the window, the outskirts of Belgrade were beginning to appear. Low buildings, factory chimneys, the gray geometry of a city waking up. "You are cleverer than I expected," Clara said. Not as a compliment, as a statement of fact, offered with the particular detachment of someone recalibrating. "I am often underestimated," Poirot said. "I have learned not to take it personally." Vasarhelyi shifted in his chair. "Clara, no," she said without looking at him. "It is finished, Imre. Let me speak." He subsided. Whatever argument he might have made died somewhere between the intention and the words. He looked at his hands. Poirot waited. "I did not go to Harrington's compartment to kill him," Clara said. "I want you to understand that clearly, because it is true and because the distinction matters to me, even if it will not matter to a court." "Tell me what you went there for," Poirot said. "For the notebook." She said it simply, without decoration. "I knew he had it. I had known for weeks that he was carrying it on this journey. My husband—" She glanced at Vasarhelyi briefly, something complicated in the look. "My husband's name is in that notebook. Not for anything criminal. He was a witness years ago to one of Harrington's arrangements, an unwilling witness. He signed a document he did not fully understand, because Harrington was persuasive, and my husband was not yet the careful man he became later." She folded her hands in her lap. "If that document came to light, it would destroy what remains of his reputation, his work, his legacy. He is 63 years old, Monsieur Poirot. His work is what he has." "So you went to retrieve the notebook," Poirot said. "I went to take it," she said, "or to copy the relevant pages, or simply to understand what was there. I had the coffee as a reason to knock. A friendly gesture, one traveler to another sharing something warm on a cold night. Harrington would not have refused. He had always found me." She paused, choosing the word with care, "agreeable." "You knew him personally," Poirot said. "We had met on 3 occasions over the years at events connected with my husband's university work. Harrington attended academic conferences sometimes. He had clients in that world. He would have remembered me. He would have been surprised, perhaps, but not alarmed. Not immediately." "And he let you in," Poirot said. "He let me in," she confirmed. "He was. Relieved, actually. I think he was frightened, being on that train. He was glad to see a familiar face." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a signal box passed the window, close and then gone. "He poured the coffee himself," she said. "I had brought 2 cups on the tray. He poured for both of us. We talked. He was trying to seem normal, calm, but his hands were not quite steady, and he talked too much, which was not like him. He was afraid of something. I asked him what he was carrying in the notebook. I was direct about it, because I thought directness was safest. He was a lawyer. He understood directness better than he understood kindness." "And he told you?" Poirot said. "He told me more than I expected. He said there were records in the notebook going back 15 years. Transactions, arrangements, signatures, many people. He said he was taking it to Belgrade, to a meeting he had arranged, and that after the meeting, certain of those records would be used in ways that would be, he said, professionally advantageous, which is how Edmund Harrington described extortion." Her voice did not change when she said the word. "He was going to use those records to extract money from the people named in them, including my husband." Poirot was very still. "I asked him for my husband's pages," she said. "I told him I would pay whatever he wanted. He said the records were not separable, that the notebook was a single document, and he would not break it apart. He said this with great pleasantness." She looked at her hands. "It was the pleasantness that made me understand there was nothing to be done through negotiation." "So you left," Poirot said. "I left," she said. "I took the tray. I went back to this compartment. I told my husband what Harrington had said." She looked at Vasarhelyi, who was sitting very still and not looking at either of them. "He told me to leave it, that we would manage whatever came, that it was not worth. He told me to leave it." She paused. "And did you?" Poirot said quietly. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. "I went back," she said. Poirot had known, of course. He had known since 5 in the morning, sitting in the lamplight of his compartment, with the little grey cells working their patient, methodical way through the evidence. But knowing and hearing are different things, and he sat now and listened with the same quality of attention he had given every word of every conversation on this train, because the hearing mattered. The details mattered. The truth, even when already understood, deserved to be spoken aloud. "What time?" he said. 11, she said, perhaps a few minutes after. Imre was asleep, or I thought he was. I went back through the connecting door. The corridor was empty. I knocked at his compartment once, as I had before, and tried the handle. The door opened. Poirot nodded slowly, the knock he had heard, the handle being tried. He was on the floor, she said. Her voice had changed, something coming into it that had not been there before. Not guilt exactly. Something older and more complicated than guilt. He was already on the floor. The lamp was on. He was lying between the bed and the wall, just as you found him, I suppose. I stood in the doorway and I looked at him and I understood that he was dead. She looked at Poirot directly. I did not kill him, she said. I went there intending to take the notebook by force if I had to. I will not pretend otherwise. But he was already dead when I arrived. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. You did not take the notebook, he said. I was frightened, she said. I had intended to be. I had prepared myself to be decisive. But standing in that doorway with a dead man on the floor, I found that my decisiveness had limits. I pulled the door to, and I walked back. Past your window. She met his eyes. Past your window, yes. And back to this compartment. And the coffee, Poirot said. The first pot. The one you brought to Harrington at 10 o'clock. I drank my own cup in his compartment, she said steadily. He poured and drank his own. I did not add anything to his. I did not poison Edmund Harrington. But someone did, Poirot said. Between 10 o'clock when you left him alive and 11 when you found him dead. Yes, she said. Someone did. Poirot stood and moved to the window of the compartment and looked out at Belgrade approaching. The city proper now, gray rooftops and church spires, and the silver thread of the river glimpsed between buildings. 15 minutes, perhaps. 10. He thought about the anonymous letter. He had been thinking about it since Vivienne Marsh mentioned it, and he had turned it over and over in the intervening hours, and now, with everything assembled, he finally understood it completely. Someone had written to Vivienne Marsh 6 weeks ago, told her Harrington would be on this train. He was almost certain the same letter had gone to Robert Carroll, that Carroll, too, had received information that should not have been available to him, about a man who had been deliberately invisible since leaving his firm in London. Carroll had said he had been searching since September and could not find Harrington. And then, suddenly, here Harrington was, on a specific train, on a specific date. Someone had arranged this. Had arranged for multiple people with grievances against Harrington to be on the same train. Had created a carriage full of suspects, a perfect confusion of motive, and then had moved through it and committed a murder that would look, to any ordinary investigator, impossibly complicated. The question was not who had killed Harrington. The question, the real question, the one that had been hiding underneath everything else since the beginning, was who had arranged it all. He turned from the window. Dr. Vasarhelyi, he said. The older man looked up. You have been very quiet, Poirot said, through this entire conversation. Quiet in a way that is different from the quiet of a man who has nothing to say. He paused. The meeting at Belgrade Station. Platform 2. Who was Harrington going to meet? Vasarhelyi said nothing. He was going to meet someone who had contacted him. Poirot continued, watching the man's face with great care. Someone who had told him they wanted to negotiate, to buy his silence perhaps, or to reach some arrangement. Someone who knew about the notebook and its contents. Someone who knew Harrington well enough to know how to make him agree to a meeting. He paused again. Someone, perhaps, who had spent years in international law and understood exactly how documents of this kind could and could not be used. Vasarhelyi's face was very still. You sent the letters, Poirot said. To Mademoiselle Marsh. To young Carroll. Possibly to Caldwell, though he did not need much encouragement as chance brought him to the same platform. You sent the letters, and you arranged the meeting, and you made certain that there would be, on this train, so many people with reason to wish Harrington dead that the question of which of them had actually done it would be extremely difficult to answer. And then, Poirot said quietly, while your wife went to see Harrington at 10 o'clock, while she provided perfectly innocently, the interaction with him that would make her the most obvious suspect. You went yourself. Separately. Earlier, before dinner perhaps, or just after. He looked at the man with the white hair and the dark, sharp eyes and the very good composure. The argument I heard, Poirot said, before dinner, through the wall of my compartment. I heard a man's voice and what I thought was a woman's voice. But the voice I heard, sharp, controlled, precise, it was not a woman's voice at all. It was yours, speaking, I would guess, in a language other than French. Hungarian, perhaps, or German. Heard through a wall and half attended to by a tired man adjusting his collar. It could be mistaken for a woman's voice. The higher register of a man speaking quietly and with intensity in a foreign tongue. Vasarhelyi said nothing, but something had left his face. The composure was still there, technically. The muscles had not changed, but whatever had been animating it from behind had shifted. You met with Harrington before dinner, Poirot said. You told him you wanted to negotiate. You confirmed the Belgrade meeting. You gave him reason to feel that there was a resolution coming, that his plan was proceeding. And you put something in his drink or in something he consumed, and you left. And you went to dinner, where I sat across the carriage from you and watched you both eat in silence, and you ate very well, Dr. Vasarhelyi, for a man who had just poisoned someone. He paused. Though I have noticed that men of a certain intellectual coldness often do. Clara Vasarhelyi had turned to look at her husband. Her face had gone through several things in the past minute and had arrived at an expression that Poirot found genuinely difficult to read. Not the shock of someone discovering a truth, but the expression of someone having confirmed something they had almost known and had been hoping, very hard, was not true. Imre, she said, very quietly. Vasarhelyi looked at his hands. For the first time since Poirot had met him, the composure was not performing any function. It was simply absent. What was left underneath it was a face that was tired and old, and had perhaps been both of those things for longer than it had let on. The poison, Poirot said. I do not know yet what it was. The doctors in Belgrade will establish that, but I suspect it was something that required preparation. Not something purchased on impulse. This was planned. Not for weeks, perhaps, but for long enough. Since September, Vasarhelyi said. His voice was different without the composure, quicker, more ordinary. I found the copies of the documents in September. The ones he had been holding over me for 6 years. I had been paying him a modest sum every quarter through an intermediary, and I had told myself it was manageable. And then in September I found that he had made copies, that the originals he had given back to me were copies themselves, and that the real documents were somewhere else entirely. That there was no end to it. He looked up at Poirot. There was never going to be an end to it. So you ended it, Poirot said. So I ended it, Vasarhelyi said. The train was slowing. Poirot could feel it. The gradual, almost imperceptible reduction in the rhythm of the wheels, the carriage beginning to settle toward stillness. Through the window, the platform of Belgrade station was becoming visible, a long gray expanse, sparsely occupied at this early hour, a few figures in coats standing in the cold. Platform 2, Poirot noted. There was no one on it now who looked like they were waiting for a meeting. There never had been, he suspected. The meeting had been a fiction, a reason to get Harrington onto this train, and to keep him confident until it was too late. He reached into his jacket and placed the green notebook on the fold-down table between them. Clara looked away. This will go to the authorities in Belgrade, Poirot said. Along with everything else. I have no power to make any other arrangement, and I would not if I could. He paused. I am sorry for what it will mean for you both. That is genuine. Clara Vasarhelyi looked at him. There were no tears. He had not expected any. My husband's reputation, she said. That is what he did this for. That is what all of it was for. I know, Poirot said. And now, she said. And now the notebook will be read by many people, Poirot said. And the reputation will not survive it. No, I am afraid it will not. Vasarhelyi nodded once, slowly, as though this was a calculation he had already performed and was confirming rather than receiving. "I knew that was likely," he said. "When I planned it, I told myself it did not matter, that at least it would be over." He was quiet for a moment. "It is a strange thing, Monsieur Poirot, to plan something so carefully and then to be caught by a Belgian in a dressing gown." Poirot looked at him. "I was wearing the dressing gown only briefly," he said. "I dressed properly before the serious work began. It was not, perhaps, the moment for it, but Vasarhelyi made a sound that might in another circumstance have been a laugh. It lasted only a moment. Then it was gone, and he was simply an old man in a train compartment with the consequences of what he had done arriving, like the station outside the window, with the inevitability of scheduled things. The train stopped. Poirot went to find Richter. The next hour was not pleasant. These hours never were. The authorities at Belgrade Station were summoned and came aboard with the particular combination of urgency and bureaucratic procedure that such situations always produced. There were forms. There were statements. There was the opening of compartment 7 and the documentation of what was inside it, and the removal of Edmund Harrington from the Orient-Express, which was a sad and undignified process, as such processes always were regardless of what the person had done in life. Robert Carroll sat in the corridor outside his compartment and watched and said nothing. His face was complicated. Grief and anger and relief all present at once, none of them quite winning. Poirot sat beside him for a few minutes and said nothing either, because there was nothing particularly useful to say to a young man who had spent 14 months looking for someone and had found only this. Vivienne Marsh stood at the window of her compartment and looked at the platform. When Poirot passed, she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and is not yet certain whether putting it down has made things better or simply different. Geoffrey Caldwell waited with his hands in his pockets and his face carefully neutral and said to Poirot, very quietly, as Poirot passed, "The notebook. My name is in it." "Yes," Poirot said. "Is there?" Caldwell began. "No," Poirot said, not unkindly. "There is not." Caldwell nodded and looked at the platform and said nothing more. By 8 o'clock the formalities were done, and the Orient Express was given permission to continue. It would be delayed into the following day's schedule, but it would continue. It always continued. That was perhaps the one reliable thing about it. Poirot returned to his compartment and sat down and looked out the window as Belgrade receded. The platform, the signal boxes, the grey rooftops, and became the past, which is what places always become when a train moves away from them. He was very tired. Not the productive tiredness of a man who has worked hard and is ready to rest, though that was part of it, but the other tiredness, the one that came always at the end of these things. The tiredness of having sat in the same small space as a man who had destroyed several lives over many years, for money, and having also sat with the man who had ended him, who had done it coldly and carefully, and out of something that was not entirely without the shape of love, if love for a reputation and a life's work could be counted as such. There were no good people in this story. He had suspected as much from the beginning. There rarely were, in the stories that found their way to him. There were only people, complicated, frightened, capable of both small decencies and large cruelties, often at the same time. Edmund Harrington had been a clever man who had spent his cleverness on the wrong things and had in the end found that the wrong things have a way of accumulating interest. Dr. Imre Vasarhelyi had been a man who loved his work above almost everything and had made one bad decision and had then made increasingly worse decisions in order to protect the first, until the decisions had become something monstrous. Robert Carroll was 28 years old and was going to have to find a way to grieve a father and a fortune and a confrontation he had rehearsed for 14 months and would now never have. Vivienne Marsh was going to get off at Bucharest with whatever it was she had come away with, which was not justice, exactly, but was perhaps the knowledge that the person who had wronged her mother had not, in the end, gone entirely unchecked. and Geoffrey Caldwell was going to Istanbul with his name in a notebook that would be read by the wrong people, and he was going to have to decide what kind of man he was going to be about it. Poirot rubbed his eyes. He ran his hand across his mustache, left side then right, more slowly than usual. He was 62 years old, and he had been doing this for 40 years, and he had never found a case at the end of which the world was straightforwardly better. Tidier sometimes, clearer, the record corrected, the guilty identified, the mechanism of the thing understood. That had to be enough. Most days it was enough. Today it would be enough. He reached for his monograph on Byzantine ecclesiastical architecture, which was still on the reading shelf where he had left it 3 days and a lifetime ago. He found his page. He began to read. He made it through 6 pages this time before his eyes became unreliable. He set it down. He let the rhythm of the train take him. Outside the window the snow had returned, light and steady, covering the fields and the tracks and the retreating shape of Belgrade in the same patient white. The Orient Express moved on, as it always did, as it always would.